Hello and welcome to World History Week 17, where we follow up last week's lesson with a couple of at least one topic that directly followed it. Talking, of course, about the 1588 defeat of the Spanish Armada by the British Navy. That, as we mentioned last week, sort of put England as the world superpower as opposed to Spain. Most of the New World exploration after 1588 was from England and not from Spain. France had quite a bit too. But another thing it did, in addition to establishing England as a superpower, it also led to a sort of a mini renaissance in England where, again, if your country is largely prosperous, one of the big things that prospers is the arts and entertainment. And we're going to open this week talking about William Shakespeare. I know you've heard the name, England's greatest poet and playwright, and it might be England's greatest hoax, too. Stop me if you've heard this before, but there are a whole lot of mysteries surrounding who or what William Shakespeare was. Now, we do know that there was a person named William Shakespeare at this time, born in Stratford-on-Avon, married, when he was 18, he married a woman named Anne Hathaway, who was 26 years old, which is very unusual for the time, was quite possibly a school teacher, but we do know in 1592 that William Shakespeare moved without his wife and children to London. We don't know exactly why, but we do know that he became active in the theater scene in London. He made a lot of money, evidently, by investing in the Globe Theater, which, of course, William Shakespeare is very much associated with. The name of a man named William Shakespeare, who was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, could have been just, though, an elaborate cover-up. Did he write all of these plays, all of these sonnets? Well, it's odd because there's no tangible evidence that the William Shakespeare who lived at this time was a writer. So who wrote them? Well, that's another mystery. Some speculate that a guy we're going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, Francis Bacon, was the ghostwriter here. He was certainly educated, brilliant, well-versed, but he had his own works to publish, and Francis Bacon got a lot published, as we'll hear, about the Age of Reason. So just from a very practical standpoint, the time it would have taken to have written the volume of work that is attributed to Shakespeare makes Francis Bacon a very unlikely candidate. Another popular possibility was Christopher Marlowe. He was a talented playwright at one time who later became an English spy, and he was supposedly killed in action as a spy. Since the conspiracy theorist goes, he faked his deaths and lived off the assumed identity of William Shakespeare to produce all these great works. Isn't it comforting to know that even in today, with all the conspiracy theories and stuff that we have to put up with on the internet, that there were conspiracy theorists hundreds of years ago? It's a human defense mechanism. The third and probably most convincing theory centers around someone named Edward de Vere, who was the Earl of Oxford at this time. He was a personal courtier to Queen Elizabeth. At the time, the profession of the theater, everything associated with, was not considered part of polite society. Even though nobles and aristocrats enjoyed theater, to participate in theater was kind of considered beneath them. It was seen as a rowdy place, like bar rooms or whatever. And certainly someone as image conscious as Queen Elizabeth would not have appreciated one of her courtiers being involved in this rowdiness that was at the time the theater industry. But we do know that there are some amazing parallels to Edward de Vere's life, and the life of the writer William Shakespeare. His own personal life seems to play out a lot of the themes covered in Shakespeare's plays. He was classically educated, traveled around Europe. He was involved in sort of an infamous love triangle, a troubled marriage. He had problems with in-laws. He was in debt. He was widowed at a fairly young age. Lots of parallels to what Shakespeare wrote about. The character of Lady Macbeth in the play Macbeth is seen by many as a representation of Elizabeth I and her struggle with the decision to behead Mary, Queen of Scots. Others believe that William Shakespeare, the writer, was just a common actor at the Globe Theatre. The real William Shakespeare, it is thought by these theorists, agreed to live a lie. Whoever Shakespeare the writer was would have paid William Shakespeare a certain amount of money. Hey, can I use your name to publish these plays? And he evidently, if this is to be believed, said yes. All the poems and plays of Shakespeare, there's no contemporary evidence of someone who was around him at the time who saw him writing. You would think that this would happen. But to date, no one has absolute proof of Shakespeare's authorship of Shakespeare's plays. Is it important? Well, yes and no. Yes, because truth is important, but no, because somebody wrote these plays and sonnets, and they were brilliant. For the purpose of the rest of this lesson, we'll just talk about Shakespeare as though Shakespeare was the writer. Whomever the writer was will attribute to Shakespeare's works. He's famous for a reason. It's incredible. Even today, I can look at Shakespeare's works and just become embroiled in it. His plays were roughly divided into three categories. There were historical plays, comedies, and tragedies. The historical plays, Richard II, Richard III, again, it was mostly about British nobility and the trials that they lived through in a country that was on a big uptick of nationalism like England was after they kicked Spain's butt. Everybody's happy. Yeah, it would be very patriotic to attend a history that looks very fondly at your country. In his comedy, Shakespeare was very good at poking fun at the roles of men and women without being too obvious about it. He had a very sly sense of humor, and it came out through a lot of his plays. He highlighted irony of situation and everything. In total, he produced 17 comedies, which really cross all boundaries of race, religion, and sex. In a very pleasant way, Shakespeare scolded mankind for its vices and sympathized with mankind because of our weaknesses. Jealousy, pettiness, true love, common underlying themes in Shakespeare's comedies. And the basic outline of some of these comedies have been copied so many years that it's a trope times 1,000 now. Again, there's so many of them. Shakespeare probably best known for his tragedies because when he did a tragedy, it was tragic. A lot of people died. Probably the most famous tragedy is Romeo and Juliet, the star-crossed lovers from Verona, Italy. There's so much about Romeo and Juliet, again, more tropes with the dramatic irony that it is beyond a classic. And it has been copied so many times. If you've seen and enjoyed West Side Story, I mean, what is that if not Romeo and Juliet set in a Latin American gang setting in New York in the 50s and 60s? The other tragedies are some powerhouses: Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, Antony and Cleopatra. His characters, both historical and fictitious, are not one-dimensional. They're deep. The character of Hamlet, people have spent lifetimes explaining the depth of that character. His plays, his tragedies cover racial issues, death, madness. His scripting was superb. Of course, all of it was written in iambic pentameter. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. 10 beats per line, hard soft, hard soft, hard soft. It's tough enough to write freeform. To write within that style was just mind-boggling. Again, whoever it was, Shakespeare or not. He also, in addition to these 37 plays, wrote, that we know of, 154 poems in the form of sonnets, which follow certain rules in terms of rhythm and rhyme scheme. The people who study this will tell you that If Shakespeare had never written a single play in his life, he would be remembered quite intensely for just the sonnets. They are awesome. It almost reminds me of reading the book of Psalms in the Bible. If you read Psalms from first to back, you're going to experience every human emotion. Psalms is very empathetic read. You're going to see anger, rage, joy, jealousy, wonder, everything. And his sonnets covered all of that. One of the most amazing legacies of Shakespeare, in addition to, of course, the sheer volume of his work, was his choice of words. He was a master of either choosing the right word to use to convey the meaning that was intended, or creating the right word. He made up words using parts of other languages, and some that just stemmed really from his own imagination. Words that we take for granted today: barefaced, bumps, fitful, fretful, frugal, gloomy, gnarled, hurry, puke, recall, spurring, suspicious. These words were created by William Shakespeare, and they are part of our daily vocabulary here 400 plus years later. He had more serious words that he developed, again, to describe something, an event, where if the available word at the time was inadequate, he created the word. Assassination, courtship, critical, disheartened, dwindle, exposure, fumitory, impartial, lonely, monumental. Very basic words as far as we're concerned. Shakespeare created them. So again, if this is the only thing he's known for, then you could argue that just his word creation is enough to be remembered as a jewel of English language and communication. His metaphors and puns, again, when the words did not exist to adequately convey what he wanted to convey, he created the word, or he created a series of words. Dead as a doornail, heart of gold, sorry sight, elbow room, full circle. All of this stem from passages in Shakespeare's plays. I could go on for another 20 minutes and not even begin to touch the importance of William Shakespeare's works to not only English literature, but really the way the world is shared through poetry and through theater. No matter who he was, William Shakespeare, the writer, whoever wrote this stuff, was beyond a genius. All right, let's move about 8,000 miles away and go to a place we haven't visited in a few months. We're going to go back to Japan. During the 1600s, as the age of reason was beginning to creep in, and as Europe was exploring brand new worlds and new possibilities, Japan was doing the exact opposite. They were isolating. They were already kind of isolated. Again, Japan is a series of islands, 4 main islands and hundreds of much smaller ones, off the coast of Asia. And so when you're an island, I mean, it's easier to isolate, obviously, but it's not like they're out in the middle of the ocean. There was lots of travel of mainland China, Manchuria, what have you. But for about 200 plus years, and while the late Renaissance, early Age of Reason is hitting Europe, Japan is completely isolated by choice. This era is what we call Tokugawa Japan. Just a little bit of history here to tell you where we were to get here. If those of you who were with us in medieval history remember Prince Shotoku, who centralized the government of Japan. He's the so-called founder of Japanese civilization. He introduced Buddhism to the island. The Japanese original religion was Shinto. It was a religion found in Japan because it believes that the Japanese are a sacred people. It was most Japanese today kind of blend Shinto and Buddhism, but During the latter Middle Ages, Japan came under the rule of shoguns and samurai. Shogun was basically the Japanese equivalent of a European feudal lord or a military commander who served under the emperor. In reality, the shogun ran the country. Even by this point, the emperor in Japan is what the King of England is now, almost exclusively a figurehead. Yes, someone to be respected, someone very rich, very influential, but not running things. The shogun was running things. The emperor, or the mikado, was mostly a figurehead. The shogun was protected by samurai knights who were known for their sharp swords and their loyalty. And again, the samurai culture developed in Japan just as the knighthood culture was developing in Europe. What happened to Japan in the 1600s that made them close their borders was the work of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa was actually from a fairly well-to-do family, but his parents were killed in a conflict with one of the neighboring factions. He spent a lot of his childhood on the run or in some kind of detention. He grew up knowing nothing but conflict. He was 60 years old in the year 1603 when he was named the new shogun of Japan. He made Edo the capital, which is now the city of Tokyo. He only served as shogun for 2 years, but through his son and their son, they continued to rule Japan under his original guidance, which was foreigners are not to be trusted. Japan had been open to outsiders for the exchange of goods and ideas. You remember Francis Xavier traveled to Japan and converted thousands of Japanese to Christianity. The Portuguese had set up fairly frequent trade deals with Japan and were very lucrative from what we understand. But Ieyasu was suspicious of outsiders in general and suspicious of Western culture, the European culture. He thought it would break down the traditions of Japan. They were very nationalistic in that respect. And he was not a fan of the very Christian idea of teaching that all men are created equal. Did not believe that whatsoever. So in 1612, he made it illegal to be a Christian in Japan. That led, as you would well expect, to a period of terrible persecution. Thousands of Japanese Christians died. As for the Portuguese traders, Tokugawa had them deal only with one port city, the city of Nagasaki, and eventually forbade even that. Even books from the outside world were banned for at least 100 years under Tokugawa Japan. Now, this long period of isolation, as you would expect, really transformed Japan. They had always been a very prideful country, very prideful of being Japanese, being different from others. As the Japanese islands competed with each other to make the best goods, a rising tide lifts all ships. Japanese middle-class merchants, really made a killing. The population tripled in Japan during the Tokugawa period. They had to grow 4 times more rice to feed everybody, but they were able to do it. And so, yes, if you remember back, if those of you who did medieval history, when we studied, how the Roman culture developed and whatnot, as opposed to the Mayan culture, which is sitting over here 12,000 miles away with absolutely no intersection. They're evolving completely independently of one another. And so it's going to get very different. Japan became a very different nation under isolation. Oddly enough, the social strata of Japan was unusual to Westerners. They, of course, the emperor and the shogun were the top of the ladder, but near the top were the farmers. They were among the poorest. Very few people got rich farming in Japan, but they were considered really second only to nobility and the high soldiers, because without them, no one would eat. Makes a whole lot of sense. They were valued by society more than the merchants. Oddly enough, the merchants, those who sold and traded goods, were sort of derided by Japanese culture because the thinking was they don't really produce anything. They just sell and market. It was extremely important to the Japanese that each person fulfill their role in society and to be loyal to the government, because the government was seen as an outcropping of the Shinto religion itself. Merchants might have been the wealthiest class, but they were not highly respected. Now, beyond this were those poor who were not even farmers, the Barakuman class. They suffered. They were very much the outcasts of society. They had the jobs that Shinto religion considered impure, like touching the dead. Laws have been passed in Japan, obviously, to protect the rights of the Barakuman, but there's still great prejudice that exists today against them. Culturally, Japan during this period, of course, developed things that you would not really see in any other country. One of the most conspicuous, sumo wrestling. During the Tokugawa period, Japanese invented this sport. Sumo wrestlers are still valued, of course, for their enormous size and strength. One Shinto tradition that they wedded into sumo was you'll see a sumo wrestler stomping around the ring before a match. That's to scare away evil spirits. They sprinkle salt on the ground to purify the ground on which they're fighting. They wore top knots like the old samurai warriors did. Another fascinating innovation of Japan at this time was sort of their unofficial secret police, which grew into the class called ninja. They were special police, again, to the emperor or the shogun, hired by local lords also to spy, fight, and assassinate under complete disguise. Stealth, deception, quiet, and disguise are the hallmarks of the ninja. They carry secretive weapons, very well versed in martial arts, hand-to-hand combat. Matter of fact, the root word for ninja is to do quietly. And of course, their history is very mysterious, and it's part of our modern-day culture. Anyone who's sleek and silent and deadly is using a ninja-like approach. It was during this period of Japanese history that origami was developed. Style of theater called bunraku was developed, where they built large-sized puppets to portray different people. There were no actors, except there were people in these suits carrying out the actions. It was during this time of Japanese history that the haiku was developed by Matsuo Basho. Again, very simple. 5 beats, 7 beats, and 5 beats. A very sparse and sometimes haunting style of poetry that probably most of you are familiar with. Under Tokugawa Japan, they returned again, really embraced some of the old Shinto beliefs, and that was all fine and dandy until it got out of hand in the mid-20th century, where that fusion of Shinto, Bushido culture, intense national pride, and worshipful reverence for the emperor made Japan a very formidable foe in World War II. We'll get to that. We'll close out with a guy we mentioned earlier, Francis Bacon. He was to philosophy what Michelangelo was to sculpting. Philosophy was his passion. Yes, he practiced law and did this to raise money, but he really ushered in this age of reason that we talk about, again, where the prevailing wisdom was, hey, it's not bad to be human. There are some good things about humanity. And he took it a step further. He believed that science and rational, objective thinking contained the answer to all of man's mysteries. If you can prove it or disprove it in science, then it's a fact. He was a good close friend of the Catholic King James I that replaced Elizabeth. He was generally tired of seeing brilliant men and women look to the past for inspiration. Remember, the Renaissance's biggest influence was the ancient Greek and Roman cultures. Now, the Age of Reason reasoned that, yeah, they were fine, but they didn't know about this new world. They didn't know about these wonderful scientific advancements. So, I mean, how advanced could they have been? So they started getting pretty cocky about what man has been able to do in the past few generations. And again, Bacon believed that the answers to all of mankind's questions could be found through systematic learning and science. He coined the phrase, knowledge is power. And it is. Particularly if we, since we live in an age where we have access to really the sum of human knowledge on our little iPhones, yeah, I mean, we have to believe that there is power in having certain knowledge, or at least the access to knowledge. He became very wealthy while serving as a judge, but he was expelled for taking bribes. And of course, for him, Francis Bacon, that meant he had more time to sit around and philosophize. The Philosophy of Science, Novum Organum, written in 1624, much like Sir Thomas More's Utopia. In the same way Thomas More imagined a perfect island with a perfect social order, Bacon imagined a perfect island with perfect science. Okay? Palaces were built like laboratories containing all the latest inventions, telescopes, clocks, microscopes, weather machines, all sorts of mechanical devices. He was a scientific geek in all the good and bad ways, I suppose. He accurately predicted the building of cars, planes, and submarines. He really thought that he wanted to classify sciences too, to separate astronomy from biology, from physics. He was so systematic, he wanted to take the very concept of science and put it into categories. Odd as it may be, he was not a good scientist himself, although he didn't have much time to do science. He was writing a lot. And he did more or less come up with what we like to call the scientific method, which is a way of establishing scientific fact. First, you make observations and define a problem that you want to solve. Then you gather data and information to help classify and define it. Then you form a hypothesis or a possible explanation for the problem based on the data. Then you test your hypothesis, experimentations, research, whatnot. And then you draw a conclusion about the hypothesis for others to read. And this scientific method is still the scientific method. It is the way science operates today and will always operate. So Francis Bacon had a lot to do with that. As science was growing more sophisticated at this time, obviously it was opening people's minds up to new ways of seeing things, new ways of thinking, new ways of reasoning. They were no longer bound to ancient philosophies or these old cultures, Greek and Roman. Facts replaced myths. People learned the world was not flat. And again, the thinking was, well, during the Greek and Roman times, they might have thought the world was flat. So how much should we listen to them in other things too? We have knowledge that they could not possibly have had. So their knowledge, their thoughts are suspect at the very best. So this helped bring about the Age of Reason. Of course, in this Age of Reason, where we look to science and rational thought to settle questions, that also means we look a little bit further away from God. Age of Reason looks inward to man and man's abilities to solve problems. It doesn't look up. Now, oddly enough, Bacon was very specific in that he did not want people to ignore God and ignore religion, and he thought, quite frankly, that science and religion each had a role in guiding us to the truth. But the Age of Reason, as it would steamroll along, would continuously move thoughts collectively away from God and more towards man. And of course, we know how dangerous that can be. There's certainly a role for everything. But interesting things are happening here during the Age of Reason. Again, Renaissance looked away from God and looked back to the Greek and Roman empires for inspiration. The Age of Reason looks to contemporary science. There's going to come some intersections here. It's been a good lesson. We'll see you Monday.